It's pretty crazy that in today's world, there are a lot of startups. There have been a lot of companies that have gotten some sort of investment over the last few years. And it's scary to think that right now, over 90% of them are going to fail within the next year or two. That's mind-boggling. That's huge. The question is, what separates those who are successful from those that aren't? Now, there's a lot of things that we can go into. I've given some talks on what makes a successful product, what makes a successful company. And a lot of it goes into you have a kick-ass product and people are aware of it, you're easy. There's all these other things. But one of the things that will always cause you issues and be stumbling blocks are the similar mistakes that I see startup founders, whether they're in the open source space or not, make over and over and over again. And as I've talked with people over the last 5 years, I have come to the conclusion that a lot of people struggle with the exact same things. And so what I want to do is I want to talk to you about the 10 most common mistakes that people make that really screw up their chances for a successful startup, whether it is in the open source space or not. Let me go ahead and tell you what those things are. So the first mistake that people make when they're building their startup, when they're founding a new company, it's typically not understanding how they're eventually going to be successful. Building a plan, figuring out how they're going to get where they need to be. It's like going on vacation and not picking the destination. Hey, sometimes it's great to get lost and sometimes you'll end up in some really great places, but a lot of times you might just end up being bored or end up someplace very scary. And so picking the destination and understanding what you're trying to accomplish is super important and critical. And this is a mistake that I see a lot of founders make. Why? I mean, you would think that how did they get money? How did they start up a company without a plan? What we found is, especially the last few years, a lot of investors have been investing in people, not necessarily plans, the passion, the vision, where things are going to go. If you have someone that's passionate, there have been people who have been willing to give money and opportunities to those people to figure it out. And the issue is, do they figure it out or do they spend time in trying to figure it out? There's certain questions that you should be asking people. There's certain key things you should be trying to understand about your business, and you need to be able to answer those. These are high-level things like, hey, how are we going to make money on this? Who is our ideal customer and how are we going to get them interested? What do they want? Can we deliver what they want? Who would we, sell against? These are common questions that a lot of times are overlooked. And because they're overlooked or they can't be answered, it puts the entire startup in a bad place. It makes so any of your employees can't be productive because they don't have the answers to those to run off and do it on their own. So they're going to look to that founder to tell them everything. So make sure you have a plan. Make sure you have the ability to go through and understand how you're going to get where you need to go and where you want to go in the first place. Now, the second one is not asking the right questions. Now, what do I mean by that? So as a founder or as someone who is in the startup space, you often have a vision that you have created based on your own experiences, but your experiences will only get you so far. A big issue that I see over and over again is a founder who thinks that all of his users will think and behave just like he does. That's a big mistake because a lot of times users and those who will ultimately pay for your product are not the same person who would develop the product. The reason that you're a founder or a maintainer is because you have something a little bit more than the average user. In fact, a lot of founders that I know would never pay for open source software. They think that's actually silly in a lot of cases. So if they would never pay for it, how would they expect other people to if they're going to think the same way? And so you need to ask your users and those who are potential customers of your product what they want. And you want to make sure that you understand what their wants and needs are and not just base it on what you think they are. If you focus just on what you think, you're going to run into trouble because you're going to build a product that you would want, not necessarily what the market would want. So the third one is navigating business without a roadmap. Now, this is similar to the plan for the business and how, where you're going to take the company as a whole and how you're going to fit into the market. But part of this is a shorter term view. I go back to the example of a vacation. So if you are going to go to Disney World and take the family to a vacation, you need to know that you're going to go to Disney World. But then there are some natural questions that come out from that. How are you going to get there? Where are you going to stay? How long will you stay? And based on that, you're going to build an itinerary, you're going to build some sort of plan, you're going to build a roadmap on how you're going to achieve your vacation goals. In the case of, your vacation goals, you want your family to have a good time. So what are you going to do about it? How are you going to plan that out? And so there are a lot of founders who throw a big number out there, but then don't put any details or thought on how they're going to achieve it. So I would ask you as a founder, as a maintainer, as someone who's putting out there, what is the most important thing for your project in the next 6 months, in the next year? What are the things, the milestones that you need? And this might sound pretty standard to those who aren't in the startup space. When you're talking about a project or a program that you're trying to build, you're going to have milestones. How are you going to hit them? How are you going to measure them? But making sure that you can break down the goals and focus on them and then understand what's going to lead to them, it's a really powerful thing that's often overlooked. A lot of times as we're running around in a startup, trying to get everything done, fighting fires, trying to get deals won, we often overlook the step of just sitting back and trying to say, okay, what do we need to accomplish? There's a lot of things we can do, but what things should we do? And we need to be able to say no to some of the things that aren't going to go to that goal. Great example of this. If you need, for instance, people to sign up and try out your software in a pre-GA state, it's not going to be ready for production. It's a beta level quality. How do you do that? If that's your number one goal, should you focus on that? What things should you do? And if other opportunities come along that don't help you meet that, you need to evaluate whether they're worth doing or not. And so I've actually had this example. I've worked with a company where their goal was to get beta signups, and focusing on the beta signups, there were certain things that they needed to get done. And there were other things that they can just say, no, we're not going to do them anymore. We're not going to do those right now. We're going to postpone those until after the beta. So if you are trying to get feedback, don't necessarily forsake the things that are going to give you feedback in order to chase the other shiny objects. Make sure that you have a roadmap and you stick to it. My number 4 mistake that I see is associating project growth with financial success or revenue. It's the old Field of Dreams adage. If you haven't seen the movie Field of Dreams, there's a ghost who whispers to this guy, if you build it, they will come. And he builds a field a baseball field in his cornfield, hoping that people will show up. And eventually they're just compelled to show up, and then they pay him money. That is not something that is going to happen to most projects. Just the fact that you have built something and thrown it out there does not mean that it will be financially successful. Even if you build a kick-ass product, if nobody knows where it is or they can't install it, it doesn't matter. So you have to have not only a great product, you need to make sure it fits the right market. You need to make sure that people can find it or aware of it. They feel like it's giving them what they need, but also that it's easy to use and easy to set up. If you can do those things, then that growth can tap into and lead to financial success. That's the flywheel everyone wants. But the flywheel just doesn't happen just because you put out some new product on Product Hunt. You release something on GitHub. You put out a blog that says, hey, we're now available in GA. It doesn't necessarily lead to commercial success. Two very different things. Number 5, deviating from your core mission. You started your startup. You started your offering specifically for a reason. You had a vision in mind. You had a core mission. And that core mission might be to solve some complex problem, to help secure, some piece of the software supply chain, to solve world hunger, end war. I mean, whatever that core mission is. And if you're focused on that, especially early on, that is going to give you permission to say no to some things. But saying no is a very difficult prospect. You have to evaluate things that are going to impact your core mission on if your core mission was right or wrong. I've seen some companies who start off to change the world in a certain way, and they continually pivot based on user feedback, but they do it in a very myopic way. One user says, well, you'd be better off served if you used your software for X. So they jump to X. And then someone else says, no, we would prefer it to be Y. So they jump to Y. And so you keep on shifting that core purpose and what your software is. That wishy-washiness will never gain you traction in the market. Now, of course, there is the concept of pivoting. And pivoting is a little different because when you pivot a company, you should be doing that based on not only feedback, but also some sort of research and some sort of hypothesis. And you don't want to pivot every week. If you're pivoting every week, you have a bigger problem. So don't deviate from your core mission unless you have concrete information or you've made a valid decision to do so. You want to focus on what you're trying to do until you realize that it is not achievable or it's not going to work out, and then you can discuss the pivot. Number 6, attempting to do way more than you are capable of. There's a lot of startups who follow the go big or go home mentality where they're going to try and build the world's greatest platform for, sovereign cloud. Well, that's a pretty big ask, and that requires a very deep pocket. So the question is, do you have the financial resources to meet your goal? And in a lot of cases, the answer is going to be no. There are very few companies who are going to get, massive amounts of money without showing some sort of growth in their customer base or the revenue stream. So focus on the few things and do them well early on, and then prove out your value. Once you can start getting additional funding and you can get people excited about the vision, that's when you can start to put money into the broader platform, the broader appeal, the broader activities, and you can start to get really deep and wide. But in a lot of cases early on, you have a choice to focus on either a very deep product in a very specific category or a very wide product, and you need to make the call on which is better for you. And so don't bite off more than you can chew and try to do too much at once, and don't try to be everything to everyone. Being everything to everyone is a recipe for disaster. You want to make sure you're very purposeful, you stick to that core mission, and you have a focus where you know what you're trying to accomplish, and then grow from that. You want to start that, small kernel, that small seed, and then you want to start to fill in the details as you go around and build in more features, more opportunities, more people in the market who would value and find your software attractive. Number 7, this is a tough one for a lot of open source companies. In open source, contributors are often considered the lifeblood of any open source project. But from an open source startup perspective, prioritizing contributors over users is a potential mistake, because what you have is a group of people and users who are contributing code who are more advanced than your standard users. They're also probably going to lean more towards not being willing to pay for your software if they can self-support, self-bug fix, add their own features, integrate their own software. By prioritizing contributors over users, you are potentially going to be chasing features and chasing things that are going to be for a very specific high-end audience, as opposed to the more general masses or those who might be willing to pay for it. So be mindful that contributors are great, and you want them, and you want to treat them, like gold. You want to give them, the praise and the focus that they deserve, but you can't ignore the users, and you have to figure out what users want and what users are willing to pay for, and that might not match what contributors want. And that's a tough thing for a lot of open source companies to resolve, but it's something that from a startup perspective, if you want to be successful, you need to do it. Number 8, don't be afraid to ask for money. I know money is a very dirty word. It's a 5-letter word, but it almost seems like a 4-letter word. Money for a lot of open source companies or startups, they're afraid to ask for money. They're afraid to ask for more. They're afraid to ask for what is probably a fair amount to pay for their software. And they want to start small, so they undervalue it. I can tell you that small doesn't always equate to a benefit or a feature for companies. When I worked at previous companies in the open source space, we would often get big corporations who would look at our support offerings or look at our software and be, that's too cheap, it must not be very good. Now that seems counterintuitive, but people place a value on your software based on what you charge them. Now, I'm not saying you should run out and charge $1 million for something that isn't worth $1 million. You need to show value for it, but don't be afraid to ask people for money, or ask people for a POC, or ask people for paid features or NRE work. There's all kinds of things that you can look for, but you want to start to build your business around financial transactions and around revenue streams. So don't be afraid to ask for money and put a monetary value that is fair for the work that you're doing. All too often, people are afraid to ask for that until it's ready, until it has all the features. This gets back to that other thing that I mentioned. Don't bite off more than you can chew, because if you are waiting until everything is perfect before you charge, you're going to miss a lot of opportunities. Number 9, nothing can ruin a company faster than hiring the wrong people. Now, as a company starts off in the startup phase and as you grow, you're going to get access to hopefully potentially more and more revenue, but you're also going to see that you are going to require skill sets that are outside of your own. As a startup founder, as a CEO, you probably are the marketing person, the salesperson, the legal person, everything. You're doing it. And as you start to grow out, you're going to look for experts in different areas. And as you hire those experts, you're going to be compelled to hire people who have been there, done that, who have experience in doing what you need. And that is awesome, and you should do that. But you risk changing the culture and changing the direction and vision of the company with every new hire. Think of it like this. When you are the only one setting the vision, when you are the only one who is setting the culture and you can adhere to it, it's very easy to keep a very concise culture. When you hire the second person, well, it's a little less. There's 2 people now. So even if you're the boss, there's going to be sway by that second person. Now, if you've got 2 people versus the 1, then the culture shifts a little more. Every new person that you hire shifts that culture. This is especially true with executive hires. A lot of times, executives, especially in the tech space, they bring along teams. Time and time again, when I'm talking to salespeople, marketing people, community teams, HR, they work with people who they value and they get along with and they think are really good. And so as opportunity comes to hire new people, they're looking to hire their previous teams, their friends, their colleagues, people that they trust, people who could fit into the system. And so you're not only going to hire that one person, you're going to hire all of the other subsequent people that they want to hire and that fit their culture. And so that can drastically shift the culture towards something that you might not intend. And I've seen this over and over again where someone will come in, they'll sound really good. They'll be, this really polished person who sells themselves well, who sells their vision well. They'll come in and then they'll try and change everything to meet what they think is the important thing. And unless as a founder, you are strong enough to say no and keep to your guidelines and keep to your boundaries, it's going to be a very difficult discussion for you to have. And it's going to lead to a lot of people feeling alienated. Number 10, what got you here won't get you there. As a company changes and expands, when you go from 2 people to 10 people to 100 people, things are not going to work the same way. You're going to need to pivot and you're not going to need to change how you're doing your job. You're going to have to change how the company does its job, how you disseminate information. You can have a personal relationship with a small group of people, but once you get over 7, 8, 10, 20, 30, 40, at a certain point, it becomes more difficult for everyone to assume they know what is on your mind and get those marching orders from you. So you need to pivot and change things. Additionally, it's similar as you start to build out the organization. You might find that your initial product offerings were a hit with the first few customers, but you can't go beyond the first few customers. So you need to be able to evaluate and pivot the company as that happens. And all too often, startups think that what worked last year, what worked at 10 people will still work at 20 or 30. And they're very late in order to pivot and to adjust the company internally, but also externally. Man, we made, our first 100K in ARR last year off of this. Why can't we make the next 100K? And it just doesn't work. And they keep on trying to do the same thing over and over again. And you know what that is? The same thing over and over again, that's the definition of insanity. There are a lot of challenges open source companies face. These are just a few of them. They're common mistakes that I see over and over again. Avoid them. Make sure that these don't become the only thing that is preventing you from success. There's lots of other things. You might not have the right timing, the right product, the right fit, the right people, but don't let these things that you do control impact your ability to be successful. We hope you enjoyed this. There's a lot of other videos and content I do on a regular basis. We would love to hear your feedback. Give us some ideas on what you'd like to hear next. Like, subscribe, and thank you to Scarf for enabling me to do these videos.